Welcome back to Ladies of Another View on Back, and we're excited to have Msgr. James Shea joining us. He's the president of University of Mary, and he's also the author of a book that I love. We both have copies, From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And what I love about it is it really relates to what's going on, issues we talk about all the time, that the culture is changing, and what can we do about it? So welcome to the show, Msgr.
It's great to be with you. Thanks very much for having me.
And we know that you're president of a Catholic university, and you're obviously Catholic, I think.
And you are the youngest university president, not just Catholic.
So this is very funny. I'm not anymore.
You're not anymore.
I was
you
for
you outgrew it.
I was for 10 years.
Not youngest. You're not.
Wow.
You don't mean not Catholic anymore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, right. I'm not youngest anymore. I'm still Catholic,
Okay.
and I'm still the president of the university. At least when I left campus, I was. I don't know about it anymore. But yeah, so I was named president at 33. And then I was inaugurated at 34, and for 10 years I was the youngest college president in America. About 2 years ago, I was usurped.
Oh, dear.
But listen who it is. So it's the president of a little Catholic college down in Nashville, Tennessee, called Aquinas College. The president there is a Dominican sister who grew up in Hebron, North Dakota. She's a college classmate of my younger brother.
Oh my gosh.
Sister Cecilia Anwaner. And she's the youngest so far as we know now. And so that's what we do in North Dakota.
There are no
We have
coincidences.
young, inexperienced, and unqualified people
love
running
that.
colleges.
I have her story in Amazing Grace for a Catholic Heart. I interviewed her right when she went into the convent. I'm
She's
going to
the
catch
youngest
up with
now.
her.
She's the youngest.
Wow.
You should have her on this show.
We should.
I think
Your
we
ratings
will.
would go up, up.
Okay,
They would
all right,
recover
all right.
from today's show.
No, don't say that. This is going to be a great show because I want to make the point. Whenever we have somebody on of a denomination, whatever the denomination is, we really think the topic relates to everybody.
Sure.
So, and that's what I want to bring out, that a lot of us are in this together, and what's happening with the culture, we are all concerned and noticing, and I like that this book really describes what's happening. It's kind of an analysis and a prescription from where to go. So let's talk about, what do you mean by Christendom and Apostolic Mission?
Yeah, so the book really is interesting in that it arose not simply out of my own thinking. It was a book that arose out of a conversation that happened among a group of good friends who really love the church over the course of many years, I think. And whereas, in the end, I did prepare the manuscript for publication, there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen and all kinds of minds thinking about this question and discussing it. And I was really honored to be a part of the conversation along the way. So the question of Christendom is interesting. When we talk about Christendom, oftentimes that phrase or that word is used to describe a medieval situation in which there was a particular relationship between church and state, and the church was established in Western Europe, or even in a place like, well, it was never established in the United States. The medieval, and so that's oftentimes how it's used as a European medieval sort of relationship between church and state. We're not talking about that here. Here we're talking more about when Christian ideals and values are the basis for a culture. And so at the very beginning, in the intro, I quote from Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who said in a conference in 1974, which was the year before I was born, he said, "We are at the end of Christendom, not of Christianity, not of the church, but of Christendom." What is meant by Christendom? Christendom is economic, political, social life as inspired by Christian principles. That's ending. We've seen it die. But then he went on to say this: "These are great and wonderful days in which to be alive." It's not a gloomy picture. It's a picture of the church in the midst of an increasing opposition for the world. And then he says that we should live our lives with full consciousness of this hour of testing. He said people of faith are in a moment in which they're being tested, and we should be conscious of that. And he said then to rally close to the heart of Christ. So this sort of picks up from this insight of Fulton J. Sheen, who was, of course, a very famous television person. This insight is echoed in a little phrase that Pope Francis likes to repeat. and it comes originally from the Apostolic document, which was a document which all the Catholic bishops of Latin America had come together to write some years before he was elected as Pope. And he said that we don't find ourselves in an age of change. Everybody's always talking about how this is an age of change or an era of change. He said this isn't an age of change, it's a change of age, or not an era of change, but a change of eras. What that means is that there are some moments in human history in which you can draw a bright line between everything that went before and everything that went after. And so the idea is that the moment in which we find ourselves is a seismic shift from a cultural perspective, in which Christian believers have been able to rely upon the culture for now centuries and centuries. It's probably since the 4th century civilization in the West, in Europe and in this country and in Latin America, has been a series of Christendom cultures in which the politics and the economics and the ruling vision, the way that people think about reality, whether they're committed or not committed, really arises out of the sort of vision of the world which comes from the gospel. That, over the course of the last 300 years or so, and more recently maybe in this country, because the secularization of Europe has happened more quickly, that over the last 300 years, and more recently here, has begun to dissipate, such that now we are facing a culture in which the vast majority of people don't take their cue from a Christian way of thinking, and that's a big change.
Right.
This past weekend, I was in California, walking through a hotel, and 2 people came up to me and said, "Do you work here?" "No, I'm dressed as a priest." And I'm like, "Well, who in the world?"
Maybe I
You
should. All right.
Christians have this permanent missionary mandate. In other words, from the very beginning, we're meant to go out to the ends of the earth and preach the gospel, right? And so that's become much, much more difficult today than it used to be. Do you remember C.S. Lewis said in the early part of the 20th century, he was already seeing this happening in his home country, in England and in Europe. And he said that when Christianity first won over the Roman Empire, so this would have been the first 3 centuries, which was a time of persecution. But he said that you can think about it like a young maiden falling in love for the first time. She had never fallen in love before, and it was the very first time, and that was very attractive and beautiful. He said that the task that Christians have today is very different. He compares it not to a young woman who's never fallen in love, but to someone that you've gotten divorced from, who you're trying to win back to the previous marriage, that there's that kind of cynicism. Lots and lots of people believe, they were raised Christian maybe they were baptized or confirmed, but along the way they've lost their faith, or they don't think that they've lost it, but they believe a kind of watered down version of Christianity, which is mostly ideas which they receive from the culture or from television or those kinds of things. And so that's a big shift, you know, and it creates new challenges. Technological changes have accelerated this as well. You know, it's been said that that people living 100 years ago were probably closer to the time of Christ in patterns of life and ways of thinking than they are to us now. In 100 years, things have changed very radically. And we're not talking simply about sort of development that we don't use candles anymore. Now we use electricity. We have electric heat instead of fireplaces. It's not that kind of change. We're talking about a change which goes very deep, in terms of which the emotional furniture in our minds and the way that we're thinking is radically different today as well. And so those are big changes. Patty, I would say to you this: they're not accidental. There was a movement called the Enlightenment, which happened around 300 years ago is when it started. And there were some good things and bad things which arose out of it. But among the bad things, of course, was a radical de-Christianization, which resulted in the French Revolution, which we've all heard about. It's funny for us to think about the French Revolution still reverberating over history and affecting us today, but that's one of the things that's happened. And what happens is that anti-Christian ideals have really seized many of the elite institutions. Lots of universities, for instance, I'm the leader of a university, but lots of universities, I think, would be centers for a kind of thinking that would be very secular. And so the secularization has been very deliberate along the way. The idea, of course, is centered in a number of things which really aren't quite true. So let's take some examples. The idea that life as a faithful Christian is a life without any freedom, that you're always having to obey imaginary laws that take away your autonomy, your freedom, those kinds of things. That would be sort of the kind of idea that we're talking about. The idea that faith and science have nothing to do with each other, that people of faith are just primarily superstitious and they need kind of a blankie to deal with life. This goes back to Karl Marx and religion is the opiate of the masses. Those are the kinds of things, as an example of some different ideas, which have really worked their way from sort of elite philosophical thinkers into the common mindset.
So they're basically saying that faith is a myth.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, and not a true myth.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So you mentioned that there is a dividing line. Where do you see that dividing line between what was and what is to be now? I mean, is it now?
Yeah, well,
Are you talking 300 years ago?
No, so it's been a gradual process. You know, I think that most would say that that divide happened in Europe around the time of the end of the First World War. That there was such a seismic and traumatic shift in the Great War seizing Europe and the aftermath of that became a moment in which there was a large loss of faith. That happened more gradually here in this country. And I'll simply give you, rather than answering the question sort of specifically, let me give you an example from my own experience. When I was growing up in Hazleton, North Dakota, not so long ago, my mom and dad, they raised 8 children on a farm. And they and my teachers and my coaches and the Catholic priest and the Lutheran minister in town were all on the same team. They all had a common project. There was this sense in which, okay, we've got a town, it's not very big, but it's full of kids. What are we going to do about these kids? You know what I mean? We need to raise them. We don't have all the time in the world, and it's really important that we help each other out. And there was a common sense of values that suffused the whole thing. They were all on the same team. And I knew that they were talking to each other. You know what I mean?
Right.
They were like communicating because there was just this sense in which they needed to go about it together. My brother is now raising 6 children on the same farm. The challenge that he and his wife have is much greater. Not because everybody's gone crazy or has become bad, but because that sort of thick culture, that imaginative vision, that sense of what life is all about, what gives life meaning and purpose, has changed radically. And so my brother and his wife can no longer rely upon the wider culture to help them. Now, of course, when I was growing up, there were bad things on TV too. And there were kind of ideas that went against the values of my hometown and my parents and the Catholic Church and in Christianity and all of those things. But there were supports as well for the raising of children and for carrying forward this vision.
And you didn't have drag queens going to libraries, right? So like, you used to understand what was good for children.
Right. And now things are just very different in that respect. And I think any priest or minister who's been in ministry for 5 minutes has had people come up to them all heartbroken, saying, we don't know what we did wrong, but we tried to pass along the faith to our children and our grandchildren, and we did our best. And we did everything our parents did. This is what people oftentimes say. They say, we did everything that our parents did. We made sure that we took them to church. We made sure that they got their instruction in the Bible or the catechism, or we sent them to religious schools, all of these types of things, and yet they don't believe anymore. We did what our parents did. Why didn't it work for us? And I think people are too hard on themselves because there's a big factor, and that's that the wind changed and began to blow really strongly in the opposite direction, such that the ambient culture was full of very powerful ideas which are very nearly the opposite of the teachings of Christianity.
There is a subtitle, Pastoral Strategies for an Apostolic Age, but that's kind of, I mean, this book is really relevant to everybody because you bring out that we are in an apostolic age. We're like the apostles, right? We can't count on the culture. We have to live our faith in a big way.
Right, and so that's probably the premise of the book that we haven't gotten to yet, which is that because we're not in Christendom anymore, we're back in a new apostolic age. The apostolic age describes the first three and a half centuries of Christianity, which was a time in which the early Christians, had a radically different view of life's purpose than the surrounding culture. And the surrounding culture was a very thick and strong culture, Greco-Roman culture, the Hellenistic culture of ancient Greece and Rome. That was a very potent vision of the world. At a certain point, in the middle of the 4th century, Christianity came to challenge and then in the end overthrow that vision and take its place, you know. And so what we're saying is that, that now we find ourselves in a new apostolic age. And so this is a time in which it's not something we've never seen before. Christianity has made its way in a hostile world before. And so what are the ways in which we can think about it? And so we talk about some of the disadvantages, of course, of being in an apostolic age. It's harder to raise children. It's harder to sustain strong Christian institutions. You know, keeping a university, for instance, as I do, with a strong Christian vision is harder than it might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago because there's more opposition, and we're dealing with all kinds of government regulation, which might be coming from a very anti-Christian place. All of those things are happening all the time. But there are advantages, too. And so oftentimes in a Christendom situation, people can become really lukewarm and just kind of go along for the ride. Oftentimes people have a lot of hypocrisy where they're pretending to care more about God and truth than they really do. That's the sin of a Christendom time. There's not as much hypocrisy in an apostolic time because you have to really go for it. The temptation is the opposite of hypocrisy, which is cowardice, pretending to care less about God and truth than you really do, trying to hide your faith under a bushel basket because you're afraid of the consequences. But in a time like this, and this is my experience at the University of Mary, a countercultural movement really does attract the highest-hearted, the ones who really want to go for it and want to commit in a great way. And human greatness, which is what we were all created for. We weren't created for mediocrity. We weren't created just to float down the river and go along with the tide. In a Christendom age, you could float down the river. You could just go with the flow. Now we've got to swim up it or paddle up it, and it's hard to do, but we were made for it. You know what I mean? And so that's a very exciting thing, and I see it in the young people that I care for all the time.
So do you think, one of the things that comes to mind growing up in the 70s, God was a mean God in the sense where if you did something wrong, you're going to hell. Pretty much, I was going to hell all my life.
Wow.
Until later, yeah, I know, we need to talk.
Sure.
But now it's flipped in the last 30 years that he's a loving God. And he always has been a loving God, but it's being taught differently to children. And so it's like, oh, he'll forgive you for that. So I think when I think about sinning and when kids commit a sin, or you know what I'm saying? It's just it's
accountability.
It's just different. It's like, oh, he'll forgive you anyway. You know, nobody's going to go to hell. Where I grew up, everybody was pretty much going to hell.
Yeah, you know, I think my interpretation of that would be that, of course, things are taught with different emphases. You know, as you know, God was never an angry, mean God.
No, and
you know
I know that.
I mean? But I think that in a Christendom time, one of the disadvantages is that there's a cultural association between sort of the mechanisms of power and the faith. And so then it can be that faith becomes a way of controlling people, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And making sure that we all behave, that type of a
Right.
thing. When all of that falls away, all of a sudden, you can't attract with vinegar anymore. You know what I mean? You've got no more whips, you've got to get some carrots out, you know, in that type of a
Right.
thing. And I think that there's a great advantage of that. Why? Because there's profound attractive force in what we believe. You know what I mean? In other words, if we understand it in its truth, it's irresistible. You know what I mean? You don't have to drive people into the cave. You can say, hey, everybody, come out into the light. And that is a whole different story. And so, yeah, I think that this is an exciting time in that way. That shift is needed.
Speaking of exciting, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Right for Life March, or the
Yeah.
March for Life in Washington, D.C., because that's such a beautiful example of people coming out in force,
Yeah.
people defending life, and it's amazing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that a place like the University of Mary does in an apostolic age is that we do need to train our young people to witness for what they believe. And the Right to Life is important. The annual March for Life happens in Washington. It's a gathering of tens of thousands of people who come together to march for those who can't speak for themselves and to stand for life. And when you go, it's an amazing thing because it's the most prayerful, the most peaceful, the most joyful gathering of people that you're ever a part of, and the most youthful. So many young people. So this coming year, we'll take 5 buses from the University of Mary, and they'll drive through the night, both there and back, and then our students will join tens of thousands of others in witnessing to life. It's a very beautiful thing.
It makes me think they're part of that Apostolic Mission,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
That's what it's about, yes.
You know, in this last couple of years, we've all gone through a lot of turmoil and the like, but there's still a lot of people with the faith that this is not a time of woe, but a time of revival. Would you agree?
Well, I certainly think so. So listen, I've said to our students, the last 2 classes that have come in, I've seen a generational change. And I think that one of the dumbest ideas in the world is that life is supposed to be easy. You know, and supposed to kind of come to us automatically and that we're entitled to all kinds of things. But that idea had been growing year after year after year. And it was causing profound anxiety and depression among our young people because that never really works. Our young people, the last couple of classes, because they've had the profound disruption of the pandemic, they've come in without that idea. They're just grateful to be together. They're just happy to have a chance to go to classes in person, and they're not taking life for granted. I hope they never forget that, because that gives us a chance for a profound cultural change. And so the pandemic has been, I think, a bitter pill for all of us to swallow, but it's also a profound opportunity that we shouldn't squander for really substantial cultural change.
See, that reminds me of Max Lucado, a blessing
sure.
and a curse. You know, what you think is a blessing could be a curse. What you think is a curse could be a blessing. This pandemic has been a curse to many, but it has brought about many blessings as well. You know, a lot of eyes have been opened up. People are getting back to their faith as well, and it's just been an amazing time. We'll get through it. I know we will, but it reminds me of the man with the white horse.
Right. Well, it's a purification. It's a moment in which things are clearer, in which each person has had to step in, out from the wind, and think carefully, what is my life really about? And that's the good thing. I just want to say one more word about how exciting this is. What's exciting about being in an apostolic time and not in a Christendom age is that the alternate vision, sort of this rebellious vision which rejects faith and says that we can find all of our meaning here in this world through the acquisition of material comfort and material things. That vision has an initial sort of attractiveness, but then if you push it a little bit or try and live it, your life falls apart. It's so boring. It's such a boring idea of what human life is about. There's no high-heartedness. There's no real heroism. You know what I mean? In all the cries of the French Revolution, the only thing we have to lose is our chains. You know what I mean? All of those great high-sounding slogans have turned into shop till you drop. Well, it's so boring. Human beings were created for more than that. And so I have great confidence because people won't settle for that in the long term. You know what I mean?
Amen.
And we see the effects of it. We see the sort of gripping loneliness and sadness, and we have to think to ourselves, we have to hold on to the truth and to the tenets of our faith, because people need it, not just us, but others need it too.
Absolutely, yeah. Amen. So
Yeah.
you make it all so exciting. And if you want to be a part of that excitement, take a look. You can get it online at University of Mary, and I think at the Merrill Pharmacy sells it. From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. Thank you so much, Monsignor, for coming on
I'm so
today.
happy to be here with all of you.
Yeah,
Thanks so
we'll
much.
have to have
Thank
you on again for sure.
I'd love that.
Okay, fantastic. We'll do it.